Hello, everyone. I am very, very honored to be here with someone who has been a huge part of my journey in leaving the left, Mr. Dave Rubin, the little bit scary but rather dapper host of the Rubin Report. He has recently written a wonderful book called Don't Burn This Book. And I'm going to first off just let him take it away, introduce himself. And I'd like to hear a little bit, Dave, on why you decided to write this book. And by the way, I love that you actually dedicated it to Ben Affleck. I think that's fantastic.
Well, Kelly, it's good to be with you. I know we bumped into each other that morning in where were we in Calgary, Toronto? Where were we?
Hamilton
We were in
with
Hamilton.
Antifa, yes.
Yes, in the airport, and you said to me that you've got a YouTube channel and you'd love to have me on sometime. And I am a man of my word, so here we are. And you know, there is a nice little thing around liberty happening in Canada right now. I know it can feel kind of weird with Trudeau and the leftists and all that. And obviously, you know, the People's Party didn't quite do as well as they wanted. That goes without saying. But I think that these movements of liberty and freedom, they start with little sparks, and it just takes time for these ideas, which I do believe are the right ideas and the good ideas, to trickle up as opposed to trickling down. So I think you guys are on the way. As for who I am, well, I host the Rubin Report, which most people probably know is a long-form interview show. You know, everyone's doing long-form interviews now, but I guess I was one of the first guys doing it on YouTube. And really what put me on the map, though, was that I was, I was sort of on the front end of leaving the left, which is very trendy right now. And I was a liberal my whole life. I was part of the Young Turks progressive YouTube channel. And I started saying, hey, guys, we liberals, we're not acting liberally. We're shouting down people. We're silencing speakers. We're deplatforming people. Where is liberalism? You know, where is the open-mindedness that I have come to believe is inherent to liberalism? We seem to be acting authoritarian. And on top of everything else, you know, everyone that disagrees with us is somehow a bigot and a racist and a homophobe and the rest of it. And really, you can watch me from videos from 5 or 6 years ago. I was a Bernie supporter. So this is not some imaginary made-up thing. And I started talking about it. I just was public about my feelings. And what was interesting, and I lay a lot of this out in the book, is that as I started talking about it, I suddenly got a lot of love from the people on the right who said, yeah, we disagree with you on a couple topics. Abortion is a big one that I disagree with people on the right about, but we're happy to have that conversation and agree to disagree. And I got just nothing but an endless amount of hate. And quickly on the Ben Affleck thing, because I did dedicate the book to Ben Affleck. I do not know Ben Affleck. I've never met Ben Affleck. I don't think he was a particularly good Batman. All that being said, I dedicated the book to him because I lay out 3 of my moments relative to my political awakening in the book. And one of them was when Ben Affleck was on Real Time with Bill Maher, and Sam Harris and Bill were talking about separating ideas from people, meaning you should be able to criticize ideas without being bigoted towards people. And of course, we all know this to be true. In other words, you could criticize the ideas of the Democratic Party, the party platform, but that doesn't mean you hate all Democrats. The same way you could criticize the ideas of the Old Testament, it wouldn't mean that you hate all Jews. But in this case, they were talking about the Quran and Muslims, and Affleck said to Maher and to Harris, "You're gross and racist." And really, it was such a perfect example of what I had been thinking about for a year, this overly emotional, feelings-based way of looking at the world that had very little to do with fact or nuance. And it was one of the things that caused my awakening, and it caused a lot of people's awakening alongside of it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So I think it's great that he got to be a part of this new journey for you. So that's, I read the book. I thought it was fantastic, by the way. Now, of course, I'm an ex-leftist myself. Embarrassingly, I did vote for Justin Trudeau in 2015. Probably one of my most embarrassing lefty moments is that. So what I'm wondering, with your lefty views, you mentioned in the book that you had a lot of perceptions. What would be the perceptions that were the strongest, that led you to be maybe active politically? Is there anything that really inspired you on the left that made you think these people want to help this group or this cause? What was your kind of most, I guess, pivotal sort of leftist belief system that you kind of had to shift?
Yeah, well, you know, what I talk about in the book is factory settings, which is a phrase that my friend Bridget Fedezi came up with the first time. And the idea is that if you grow up in America, and I think you guys have a version of this in Canada, that the factory settings are sort of like Democrat good, Republican bad, conservatives care about money, liberals care about poor people, like a series of things like that, that they sort of seem right. And it's sort of what it's handed to you through academia, through public education, through movies and television and culture and all of those things.
Yeah.
And what I found with the real lefties, the progressives, is that they were just louder and angrier about everything. So it feels very morally right. You know, if you're always screaming about things and you have righteous indignation, and all of your opponents are Nazis and bigots and the worst things in the world, well, then there's a real self-importance that come with that. So if the question really is to ask me about some of my liberal beliefs, I mean, most of my what are thought of as liberal beliefs now, I can explain through a lens that's more libertarian, which is actually the classical liberal lens. That's the point of the book, that leftism, socialism, democratic socialism, collectivism has nothing to do with liberalism. The word liberalism has just been butchered. Liberalism, in its truest sense, is about individual rights. If you live in this country legally, I want you to have the same exact rights as anybody else, regardless of your skin color, your gender, your sexuality, or the rest of it. And then we have the light touch of government, that every now and again, the government has to get involved to keep the wheels on the machine, to keep the machine going, basically. That has very little to do with modern leftism, which is about collectivism. It's about group identity. Then you throw identity politics in there and you have a really, really toxic stew. But some of the things that I think about, that I believe, let's say from a leftist perspective, I'm for gay marriage. I'm for legalizing marijuana. I'm against the death penalty. I'm for some level of public education. I think the state can have some role in healthcare, actually. I don't want it to have a totalitarian role and run everything, because the state doesn't do anything particularly well, but if it could do something with some private enterprise, I'm actually okay with that. So those things are thought of as supposedly lefty things, and yet I get nothing but hate from the left. And when I bring up any of those issues with people on the right, I've debated gay marriage with Ben Shapiro, I've debated the death penalty with Michael Shermer, with Dennis Prager. I'm sure I've talked about it with Shermer as well, and a whole bunch of other people on those issues, and we agree to disagree, and it's okay, and it's just fine. Glenn Beck and abortion. I mean, there's a million of these topics. So something interesting, in my opinion, is happening on the center right, which is sort of very open to ideas right now. And something sort of rotten has happened on the left.
Yes, it absolutely has. So that kind of leads into my next question. You've distinguished between the left and liberalism, which is very important, because there's a big difference. Do you feel you ever dipped into leftism at all? Did you dip your toes in activism? Were you ever an SJW, so to speak? Or do you feel that you were always this classical liberal, you really stayed much the same, and the left really left you?
Yeah, I think it's the latter, that the left left me. You know, that's sort of the Ronald Reagan line, you know, that the Democrats left him. You know, it's interesting because my general disposition, let's say, is fairly calm. You're getting, this is when I'm off camera, this is how I am. When I'm on camera, this is how I am. And when I was at the Young Turks and they were always screaming about everything, I don't know that I ever did that per se, but I did fall into some of the traps. Somehow that everyone against us is racist. When you hear it over and over again, and by the way, we're hearing it in a very strong voice right now because of what's happening in Minnesota, that somehow white supremacy has taken over the United States and this country was founded on racism and all of these things. And the truth is, we're the least racist society in the history of the world. What happened to George Floyd, the man who was killed by that police officer, and I will say brutally killed, murdered by that police officer, who, by the way, is in custody, will be charged. Now it sounds like a few other people will be in charge. It's a travesty. It's horrific, absolutely horrific. That's one potentially racist, but just otherwise really bad man doing one terrible act. There's no bones about it. What you can't do at the same time is then decide to burn down a city because of it. But that's a slight sidebar here. The underlying topic of sort of thinking that everything is viewed through a racial lens. So it's odd that it's the people that are the supposed anti-racists that seem to push a racial lens on everything. I actually think that most people in America and Canada and most other Western nations, they're not racist. They want you to go about living their life, your life, and they let them live their life, and let's agree to disagree, and actually relish in the fact that we live in a country or countries that have people with different opinions. But the idea that most people are walking around with some sort of racist feeling that's dictating their decisions, or homophobic feeling or something like that, I just don't buy it. But that's very much embedded in modern leftism.
It is this presumption that the darkest possible thing is behind it. There's always a dark intention, and this is what worries me, is sort of the depersoning or depersonifying of people that are on the right or who have, what you would call wrongthink. When you make that person into sort of a monster, it's much easier to perpetuate violence, etc. And what's going on in the States is horrible to see, by the way. I'm sorry to see what a state of chaos it's in. It's hard to see from the outside. I can't imagine what you guys are going through with all of that, because the division is ramped up immeasurably. And the media, of course, is just doing what they do best and making it far worse. Yeah. Speaking of, sort of these sorts of interesting ideas and thoughts that can come at you, come against you, I guess, criticisms, and a lot of times just hate, straight hate. In your experience throughout
once or twice.
Yeah, once or twice, just a couple mean tweets here or there, right? What group do you find you get it the worst from? Would you say, because you're making a lot of people angry. There's the far left, which can include activist journalists. I know you're probably making Islamists and political Islam, people that are in promotion of that. You've made them uncomfortable. You're also Jewish, so that can really cause some tension. I suppose you probably have had pushback from, I assume, the LGBT lobby, just because I know you've talked a lot about trans issues, not particularly popular opinions. Or have you had most hate just from anyone on the right? How have you found it to be, or has it just been an even amount of pushback all around?
I don't know that I've ever fully quantified, busted out the calculator and figured out exactly where the hate is. I would say 90% of it comes out from just sort of standard lefties. This is just, sometimes blue check journalists on Twitter, but, just a bunch of anime avatar foxes on Twitter and anonymous accounts. But, they all claim that they're democratic socialists or Bernie bros or something like that. And it's just like endless hate. It's like, make a good argument and I'll gladly respond to it, actually, if I have time. But, it's just an endless barrage of hate. But yeah, I think some of those other groups probably aren't thrilled with me. Look, I piss off some groups on the right, but what I would say is, excluding like the far right extremists that have no power, no institutional power, no one thinks they're good, no one thinks these are good ideas. Look, in my book, as I said, I take a pro-choice argument. That is the biggest no-no for people on the right, for people that consider themselves conservatives. Yet I have not gotten any hate from people on the right for that. What I've gotten actually are probably hundreds of emails and certainly tons of tweets and everything else from people on the right saying, hey, Dave, I really enjoyed your book. I think you're wrong about abortion. Here's my thoughts, but, we can maybe agree to disagree or whatever it is. That is something, again, why I talk about the center right being sort of a rich spot for conversation right now. Because you would think that if I was saying something that's so against their views, if they behave like the left, they'd be saying all these awful things about me. But they're actually not. They're trying to build bridges. So I'm much more interested in building bridges than burning bridges.
Yes, if you can go for the peacekeeper mode, that's always the ideal, right? If you can.
I'm trying.
Speaking of peace, you mentioned in your book and on one interview I've seen, but you haven't talked much about your new view on spirituality. Jordan Peterson, who is someone who is also a big part of me, not just leaving the left, but getting out of victim mentality and just really making my life richer. He's an incredible man, as you've said. So he has changed your view a bit on spirituality, and you've probably grown and maybe explored that even more since you wrote and published the book. So do you mind letting me know where you're at? What are your thoughts on spirituality right now?
Sure. I lay this out a bit in the book. I'll try to expand it just a bit here. I never really considered myself a believer or a non-believer in a sort of big way in my life. I sort of believe that I'm here and that's good. And, I try to do the best I can when I'm here. And, sometimes I fail at that. But that was sort of my view of life. Then a couple of years ago, I had several prominent atheists on the show. And I enjoy talking to atheists and I like talking to people of all perspectives, usually, or most perspectives. And I sort of got pinned into saying that I was an atheist. It sort of came out one day in the midst of a conversation. I didn't really think much of it. And then the atheist community really sort of came behind me and started backing me and saying that was great and all that stuff. But I never loved the word and I never was that comfortable with it. And then a couple of years ago, I do my August off the grid where I have no phone, no television, no news, no nothing. And it kept popping in my head that I really didn't want to be thought of as an atheist because I do believe in something, even if at that time I couldn't quite define it. I believe in something outside of myself. So what I write about in the book is that, first off, let me say this. You can absolutely be a non-believer and be a moral good person. Several of the people who I've mentioned already, whose books I have right here, from Sam Harris and Michael Shermer and Peter Boghossian, these are atheists. I have no doubt that they're good, decent people and all of those things. I think for a society to flourish, to actually be able to withstand the forces of tyranny that ebb and flow over the decades, over time, that a society can only organize around something bigger than itself. And by the way, that's exactly what the United States has done. We talk about in the Constitution God-given rights, meaning that you are free. The government did not make you free. The government is then set up to protect your freedom. But the government didn't make me free, because if you say that the government made you free, in essence, you're saying man made me free, because man made government. But no man, there's no man in the US government, man or woman in the US government that is making me free. Now, could they take away my freedom using the power of the state? They could, and hopefully will not. But could they do that? Yes. So I just believe that there are eternal truths about good and evil, things that are outside of us, that guide us even if we don't fully understand it. Why do I fight Google when they demonetize me or depress my algorithms? Well, depress my views in the algorithms. Well, there's a story in the Bible about David versus Goliath. So if David could beat Goliath, the little guy could beat the big guy, then maybe Dave could beat Google. I think that there are things that we know are true that we can't quite explain all the time. But more than anything else, I would say my system of belief is functional. It is functional in that I see no way around belief to organize a society. To just say, oh, Enlightenment values and we'll be good to each other and all of those things, it just won't work. Look what's happened to the left right now. I mean, if Enlightenment values and liberalism could just stand for itself and being nice to one another and the rest of it, well then leftism or liberalism would have proliferated everywhere in the best possible sense, and yet we're watching it collapse right now.
Indeed. And I know from experience, it can become almost a bit of a religion itself. I've talked to a lot of ex-SJW, ex-leftists, and just classical liberals like yourself, who really recognize this element of almost its own sort of theology behind it. There can even be a cult mentality, depending, but that's a whole different story. I try to, on this channel, get into the personal stuff. You're very open in your book. I do recommend it for anyone listening. And you're very open when you speak. You wear your heart on your sleeve, which is part of why I appreciate your content. But I try to really touch on things that maybe everybody else isn't asking. So I know you've talked a lot about your book. I want to just touch on something a little more personal, something that I relate to, which is being a dog owner. Now, of course, you recently lost a pet, and I'm so sorry about Emma. But you've also found a new companion named Clyde, and he's quite the charmer. And I just wanted to know your story with dogs. Did you grow up with dogs? What do dogs mean to you? What have they meant in your life? Or are they just?
Oh, I'm so much happier to talk about this than talk about politics.
Way more
over
fun.
and over.
I agree.
That's great. That's great. Well, actually, I did not grow up with dogs in the house. We didn't have dogs, cats, or anything. I had a turtle at one time. We had a couple hamsters when we were kids, but we didn't have dogs. And I got Emma. So she was my original dog. I got her in the summer. It was actually June 22nd, 2006. And I know the date because she was a rescue from Hurricane Katrina, which had happened in New Orleans in August of 2005. And she was so sick that she wasn't able to be adopted until about 10 months later, June of the following year. And she gave birth during the hurricane. They found her in a box with 3 puppies. And she was just the most magical, wonderful dog. I got her in New York City. And she lived a great life. So she lived in New York City. We went to the White House. I took her to the Grand Canyon when we drove cross country. She lived in LA. I mean, she lived in New Orleans, New York, and LA. I mean, pretty sweet life for this dog. And she was just the sweetest thing on the planet. And we had to put her down, let her go in February of this year. She was 16. She had bladder cancer. It was a tough year, but we did it right, and we gave her her last meal was just a whole cooked chicken that we just put on the floor and let her tear it apart, and then we said goodbye. And then actually, we weren't going to get another dog for a while because we wanted to just have a break. Number one, because it was obviously very emotional those last couple months, and it's a lot of work. When you're dealing with it's like dealing with a older grandparent or something. It can be a lot of work. Yeah. So we want to break, but on top of that, I was also supposed to be on a book tour. And we were going to be traveling so much that we just thought, all right, why don't we just wait till the end of the summer and we'll get a dog probably in the beginning of the fall. And then when the lockdown happened because of COVID, I quickly glanced at a couple articles and they were saying that LA shelters are going to have to put down all of these dogs because they don't have enough staff. They don't know what they're going to do. And I ran to our local shelter. And our local shelter is actually a non-kill shelter. It's a very small shelter. And just about a half hour before, they had rescued a couple dogs that were due to be put down that day. The order was already signed. I actually saw the paperwork that they were to be put down. And I saw this guy in the back who actually looked bizarrely like Emma, although that wasn't really the reason I went for him. And I went up to him. He had no name at the time because they found him with a collar with no tags. He was on the street. And he was just super sweet. He had a scar. He's got a pretty significant scar in the middle of his forehead. So he's lived through some stuff. Yeah. And, right before we connected on Skype, he was barking up a storm. So we're getting him trained right now because he's, now he's free and happy. So he's very emotional. And I'll just say one other thing, which it's something to go from, the last year of a 16-year-old dog with health issues to go from that. And then the next dog you bring in is a 1-year-old who's ready to roll and ready to play all the time. Man, it's like having two different species in your house, really.
Yeah, same bundles of joy, just different personalities. I guess the cheesy saying is true. You don't rescue the dog rescues you.
The dog rescues you, yeah.
I'd say that's true. Well, it's all the time that we have. You're a busy man right now promoting this book on your COVID virtual tour. Everybody, don't burn this book. Thinking for yourself in an age of unreason, which I think is an apt description. Do you have any last words, Dave?
No, thank you. And keep up the good work. And look, the fight that we're on, it's not always the most rewarding fight because it's a good fight. And that makes it a little more difficult. It makes it a little harder to get traction at times. If we were just screaming baseless slogans about everyone's racist or the system is evil or all of these things, it would be a lot easier to gain traction. But if you want to be authentic and real and good and all of those things, it takes work. So just keep it up.
I appreciate that. And yourself included, you've made a big difference and a lot of people are shifting their views. So we just got to keep the discussion going as best as we can. So thank you very much for coming on. Really appreciate that. Everyone, I will have links in the description on how you can purchase this book for yourself. Please keep watching. He's doing lots of interviews to discuss the content of the book. And as always, be good to each other, but never because the government tells you to. Goodbye.
See you, Kelly.
See you. Take good care.